Welcome to round 9 of Gukesh versus Ding, and today Gukesh came with the white pieces, and he repeated with pawn d4, the first time he's repeated his white opening for round 3 that earned him a victory. Let's see what he had in store. Ding, knight f6, very flexible, waiting to see what Gukesh might do. He might even go for a London system, a Trompovsky, or the classical c4, just putting 2 pawns in the center. And from here, pawn e6, sort of diverging a little bit from Grunfeld and King's Indian structures, going for more central play with pawn e6, perhaps aiming for a bishop to a check, d5, even c5 for Benoni, Benko, and Blumenfeld, such ideas. In any case, g3, diverging from other plans of knight c3, where the plan might well be control the center a bit more, aim for an e4 push, and go down essentially Queen's Gambit variations. But g3 marks the Catalan, where, well, Magnus Carlsen himself has tried it, and it's a very topical approach by Gukesh, where bishop g2 and the Catalan bishop just strikes at the queenside. Bishop b4 check, and it's worth noting, as I've mentioned in other videos, d5, knight f3, bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, and d takes e4 is, of course, the very well-known main line. White then tries to attack the pawn on c4. Black often gets a tempo, or at least hope of earning time on the queen to c4, and then develops the bishop and controls the center, and it's a very well-known main line where c7 is targeted. Meanwhile, black tries to break free. However, bishop b4, back at this moment here, is a nice little, almost sideline, but very topical these days, where after bishop d2, black simply retreats, trying to claim that this bishop is a bit misplaced. Yes, black spent 2 moves, but this bishop isn't where it wants to be. The knight wants to be there. So it's a bit of a Schwissensuk, where the knight on d2 can't be achieved as quickly. Bishop g2, developing the Catalan bishop. And there followed d5, very central, and we've now got a very similar position to the main line we just saw, but white has, of course, played bishop d2. So if black ever captures on c4, the bishop on d2 is perhaps a bit more developed. So not so much d to c4. Black's going to, as we'll see, solidify in the center. Knight f3, castle's kingside, and from here, c6, super solid, making a pawn pyramid in the center, defending a nice anti-bishop structure. It's a very common motif we've seen, very safe and sturdy. Of course, yesterday's game in round 8, Gukesh had a lovely jacuzzi pawn structure, and here we've seen a very similar anti-bishop structure against this bishop, where black says, come on, if you think you're hard enough, good luck getting through there. And, well, white will certainly be trying e4 breaks, developing the knight in some way to support such a thing. Rook to d1, attacking the queen. Let's see what happens. Queen c2, first moving the queen to allow for the rook to come over and x-ray to the queen. Develop the knight to d7, and, well, the bishop looks a bit sad, a bit trapped, but had it come out earlier, it would be a little bit of a target, and it would have taken time, and queen to b3 would have been a problem. So the bishop's safety first, in some ways, just stayed there. And b6, a bishop to b7, or even Queen's Indian style bishop to a6, where the pawn on c4 could be targeted. Rook to d1, x-raying, and b6, hoping to develop the bishop this way. And also supporting an eventual c5, and maybe stopping white from playing c5, although black wouldn't be unhappy with white ever playing c5. b6 would then happen, e5 would then happen, and black's putting a lot of pressure on the center. So mainly twofold. Bishop to here, pawn to c5, a very good set of plans by black. Bishop c3, and this is where both sides, knowing this position quite well, is a Catalan variation where both sides would have played and seen this before. And bishop c3 was the first moment where Ding, after 20-odd minutes, played bishop b7, just thinking through the repercussions of this. The main idea for white is to play knight to d2, perhaps b3 or b4, and be able to retreat the bishop in some variations and keep it on this diagonal, and also to deter e5. And of course, if black can't play e5, their only pawn break is c5, which is basically impossible to stop. But if that now happens, this could, of course, be very, very useful. So after knight bd2, queen c7, just preparing. There's no need to rush. Often it's good to position your pieces where you want them and then strike. Both sides are doing that, hence why white played rook a c1. It's important to note, if e4 now, because black is a little bit ready, this is possibly premature. For example, d takes e4, knight takes, and c5 starts to gain a bit of an attack. But even in the reverse, after e4, d takes c4, knight takes c4, and c5, and then once again e4 is a bit creaky. Black has positioned their pieces reasonably well. This is opening up, but it's sort of justifying black's piece placement. If ever e5, the problem with this, knight immediately jumps to d5, this bishop's buried forever, and black's control of the light squares is pretty evident, and black would be fine. So e4 would have been a bit premature, perhaps, and for that reason, rook a c1, preparing. e4 and other pawn breaks, as we'll see, perhaps pawn to b5 might well be very useful, but just preparing, once again, positioning their pieces. After rook a c1, therefore rook fd8, striking back. So both sides have placed their queens on the c-file very sensibly, off of the potential files of the rooks, making way, opening the back rank up. So very sensible position. That being said, Ding has spent 30 minutes at this point versus Gukesh's 3 minutes. So still, one side is clearly more comfortable perhaps, but in terms of the position, rather than preparation, Ding would not have been unhappy. b4 by Gukesh. About 10 minutes thought, just under. And well, this comes with a specific purpose, to play b5 and destabilize this pawn pyramid here. The downside is, black says, well, if you can expand on the queen side, so can I, and Ding immediately struck, I say immediately, with about 20 minutes thought, with pawn c5, striking at these two pawn hooks. And the idea is quite simple. If all of these pawns trade off for one another, perhaps these three for these three in red and green, then it's very, very level, and, well, this semi-forces b takes c5. If, for example, this move, there's going to be a bunch of issues with giving the c5 square up for this knight. That's a lovely outpost that can't be touched. There's no real play. The only plan I can see would be pawn a5 to maybe attack, but that doesn't achieve too much. Again, with this knight coming in here, good luck breaking through. So pawn b5 is a bit overstretching, doesn't achieve too much. Obviously, if it's left there, then this is an issue. And if, for example, a3, black just builds up pressure behind slowly but surely, and eventually these three will have to trade off. And if that happens, well, that's indeed what Gukesh played initially with captures. Now here, to keep pieces on, queen b2 was essayed by Gukesh, with the idea being this diagonal. If captures persisted to happen, then very likely these two remaining pawns would trade at some point, either d takes c4, a knight, or indeed queen takes c4, likely knight's better, or if c takes d5, then knight or bishop can capture back, and that would lead to a very symmetrical 4 pawn island versus 4 pawn island. Pawn v pawn, pieces pretty identically set. Mild tension between these two. Perhaps this is more automatically defended, whereas this needs to be considered. But ultimately, very symmetrical, and it would peter off to a draw. So Gukesh playing queen b2 at this moment showed some definite ambition, let's put it like that, down this diagonal, saying if you start liquidating here, firstly, this sidesteps, and the queen's obviously x-rayed through too. Also, this is under attack, potentially, in a lot of variations. If the knight ever captures on d5, it's not possible right now. And here, perhaps rook a8 should have been tried by Ding, just keeping the tension, and once again improving the pieces, both sides not wanting to blink, because essentially, if this happens, this knight can capture and is annoying, and if this capture happens, this knight could capture and attack the bishop in some form. And also, if white captures here, this knight will capture, and now, very evidently, an annoying fork, or indeed to the center, one or other, very, very annoying for white. So neither side really wants to capture and allow a piece to the center, so the tension's being maintained, and that's why rook a8 makes a lot of sense to just x-ray through. But instead, Ding played knight b6, and now bishop a5 was played very rapidly by Gukesh, pinning to win, and maybe just putting a little bit of pressure on the position, keeping pieces on. The queen's now sidestepped out of the way, the rook is on the queen. Perhaps black's pieces are being hit at a little bit, so definitely not willing to just liquidate off into the aforementioned drawish positions, or the very least level positions. Keeping pieces on, trying for something. Well, d takes c4, liquidating, pulling the brakes. Now, in this moment, rook takes c4 is actually very possible, because if knight takes rook, briefly on the queen, so not so much for this reason, but more because knight takes c4 and the skewer of the queen to the rook persists. And now queen c6, firing back, bishop takes rook, perhaps rook takes rook, just exploiting the undefended rook on d1, and then knight c d5. It's worth noting, if something like this, then knight e4 is a very nice blocking, and if ever f3, this feels very nerve-wracking for that diagonal, and if f4, then I can just jump back, f5 can come in the near future, and this is under attack, so very, very tricky. Meanwhile, bishop f6, the repercussions of f4 and f3 really rear their ugly heads. For that reason, well, exploiting this doesn't achieve too much, and the queen can always drop back in a lot of variations in any case. Albeit right now would be a threat, but that's the reason why knight e4 a critical and knight d5 a critical blockage of this bishop. In any case, rook takes c4 did not happen, and knight takes c4 occurred. Main reason being the tactic, of course, still works out. If knight takes c4, white recaptures with the rook. They do not capture the queen because both sides go on a capture spree, and black is the one who wins the day. So rook takes c4 instead, and because both bishops are under attack, then simply because black is obliged to, they are skewered here. Queen takes a5, queen takes, black can play knight d7, defend this, and ultimately by kicking the queen, even if captures, for example, just rook a b8, queen c6, and knight takes c5. The queen can't stay pinning the knight forever because this queen covered all those squares, and obviously the rooks did the rest, and so once the queen's kicked off of the 7th rank, the knight can just capture back. Mass trades would happen, and we reach one of the relatively many possible scenarios where it's 4 versus 4 and 1 versus 1, with opposite coloured bishops and an otherwise equal array of pieces. Rook, rook, queen, queen, knight, knight, and opposite bishop. 5 pawns each, so relatively level if such a thing had happened. Now, retreating back to this moment here, knight takes c4. Well, Ding actually tried bishop takes f3. The idea being to reduce the pressure on the weak b7 bishop. But in exchange for, of course, after bishop takes f3, giving up this. Now, firstly, Gukesh fixed the weakness on b6 and then captured a very important mechanism in the position here, fixing this b6 weakness. And rook a6 occurred on the board, where had Gukesh played knight e5, now exploiting his Catalan bishop down the entire diagonal, hoping to get knight to c6, perhaps bishop d6 could have been played, and then knight to c6, rook might move, queen to b3 just to prevent any funny business here, and white still might have maintained some possible edge, albeit only through piece activity. Typically in the Catalan, it's all about, firstly, this is an octopus knight, but it's all about the activity of the pieces and can they make waves through the structure. There's still chances to trade off, but of course, this is a good knight, possibly better than this knight, and also this bishop controlling some useful squares. Black is inhibited from moving their rooks and queens to these squares. Meanwhile, the knight can't use this, whereas this bishop is chewing on granite a little bit. That's very, very solid. Black cannot hope for an attack. That would very much hurt their king rather than help their attack. Just king g2, and I think white would be the one loving the opening of the h-file. So that's very solid. That's never going to change. And that's the main point of a Catalan position, where you just sit tight and use your bishop. Well, instead of knight e5 at this moment, Gukesh played queen b5. And the downside is that rook takes a2 happened 2 minutes later by Ding Liren. Notably, huge time disparity here, 30 minutes and less and counting, whereas Gukesh has over 70 minutes. So definitely preparation-wise and so on, Ding's a bit under pressure. But the problem is, for Gukesh, the position is liquidating here. And after knight takes b6, the very accurate queen a7 works wonders, attacking the knight. And ultimately, because these two are now going to trade off, rook a6, rook b8 pins the knight. Yes, white has briefly won a pawn, but it's impossible, in fact, to hold on. Even, it's worth noting, h6 would be a very good waiting move. That's how relatively level and equal this is now. Dare I say drawn. Because white's knight really can't get out without this pawn dropping. Of course, black won a pawn, white won a pawn, and now, once these liquidate, white has to make sure the knight can escape, which it can. But thereafter, it will trade off to a 4 versus 4 in green here. Queen a7, however, forces matters. I think it was commented and described as killing the game on the spot. Suddenly not risking anything. The safety-first approach by Ding Liren makes some sense here, just making sure that there's no risk of losing. Queen a7, hitting the knight, and there followed queen b1, attacking the rook, rook to a pin. Of course, the rook's defended. And after d takes c5, briefly a pawn up, but it's not to be, because rook a6 really works very well there, pinning or attacking the pin piece again. And this is the problem. Bishop takes c5 is now impossible to stop. Queen b5, bishop takes pawn, removing the defender, briefly losing the bishop, but of course then losing this. The queen's traded off. The rook's traded off after rook c6. Rook takes, bishop takes. And we now have a position where, well, there's only really action on 32 squares of the board on the king side. And it's going fast towards a draw. But of course, move 28, there's no draw offers until move 40. And it's slightly hard to see a potential 3-fold. There's no immediate ones. Perhaps the rook could just shift here, the bishop move back and like this. But, well, let's see if Ding would acquiesce. No, he played g5, improving his structure, aiming potentially to lock down, giving the king some luft on the dark squares. And it's worth noting that the bishop's long-range ability favours play on both sides of the board. Well, there's no play on this side of the board. And that means that, although this knight is slower, there's nothing as much as in other positions with dynamic play across the entire board, where the bishop can use its faster ability to move. There's no targets exactly for the bishop to attack. And that means the knight being slower can do whatever it likes. It can take time to move around, and the fact the bishop can move very fast, well, time isn't as much of a factor between the two bishops, or the bishop and the knight, two minor pieces. Of course, black also has a rook, which is very handy to do long-range things. So the fact that it's on one side of the board perhaps just means vaguely favourable minor piece. Position still very much level, and with best play it would be a draw. But let's see what happened, because after king g2, rook to the 2nd or 7th rank from black's perspective, king f1, Gukesh would be happy with a draw at this point, because there's no realistic chance of breaking through. The knight covers the infiltration squares for the bishop and the rook, and black has activity. And as we'll see in just a few moves, Ding takes the fight to Gukesh, one last little attempt to achieve a good structure. If black can achieve a nice knight in the centre, or perhaps, for example, in a moment where this is a blunder, but in a scenario like this, that knight on f4 would be very, very useful. So, of course, g4 was a blunder, but just to show, if that knight ever jumped to f4 now, there's definite risk for white. Still holdable, but exactly, it would be holdable rather than pleasantly cruising to a draw. So black needs to, or white even needs to repel black's attempts, and he activated his rook, going over here, rook c2, attacking the bishop, bishop retreated, the bishop retreated back to d3, and the knight did an aforementioned using all the squares, coming to the centre, and now f4, stopping that, trying to meet black and trade pawns off. Of course, the more pawns that come off, the closer it is to a draw. Even if black achieved a very luxurious rook and knight versus rook, that is a theoretical draw and one of the slightly easier ones, or more easy ones, to hold. So, captures, worth noting. h4 looks tempting, but ultimately would force more liquidation. That's why Ding very likely didn't go for it. For example, f5, and this king's in the way. And we see king g2, rook a7, tethering the rook to the defense of the knight, and ultimately would liquidate off to a draw. So, g takes f4, g takes f4, and rook c3, king f2 activating, knight c5, and now we saw a transformation of the position, the final attempt by Ding. Notably, neither side have been in time pressure at this moment, no increment, but with a dozen or so or more minutes throughout the last 10 moves of the first time control. So this was all played relatively comfortably, no time blitz finishes today. And now pawn takes. Now, it is a draw objectively, but these three, if this pawn was on g3, pretty much an immediate draw. But with these here, Dingleren did play on for a few moves. Rook c2, king f3. Perhaps this could be something white doesn't really want to allow. And after rook to d2, white's plan was slightly passively, but very solidly, to play rook a3 and hold the pawn this way. And perhaps Ding could have tried h4 here, where you can force this king to an inactive square and maybe come for here, but after just rook a5, ultimately this would still liquidate out to a draw, but would have maybe tested Gukesh to, well, that king is trapped and they have to prevent this. It is a draw, but Ding could have attempted this just to go through the motions of achieving the drawn position. As it was, rather than the h4, king g6 was played, and the problem is the rook will always be able to check if the king ever reaches forwards. And after f6, a draw was agreed with further liquidations off the board. And here we see everything trading off to a draw. King e5 was not played, it's worth saying. That is moving the king to the centre. Afterwards, they put the kings on e4 and e5 to show it is a draw. And everything is liquidated off. So a peaceful conclusion to an interesting game today. And, well, the Catalan showing itself on the board, where after just the first 5 or so moves, the Catalan bishop striking forwards. And perhaps in the middle game, around the moment where b4 was played, perhaps that was a little, at this moment, a little bit too much, because it invites trades. Black has the aforementioned very nicely placed pieces. This forces liquidations. Of course, Ding with black, fine to take a draw up preceding the rest day. Perhaps b4 was a little bit too much, and instead a move like e4 is possible, maybe knight e5 in some variations. An interesting moment, nonetheless, that led to all the liquidations we then saw. So, a peaceful conclusion between Gukesh with white and Dingleren with black today. Rest day tomorrow on the 6th of December, and tune back in for the 7th round 10 of the World Chess Championships. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. See you then. Cheers.